right, we're going to continue with our discussion of the lymphatic and immune system. This video will talk about immunity and the immune system specifically. So when we define the term immunity, it's simply removing or killing foreign substances, pathogens, or cancer cells from the body. And it's important to recognize that cancer cells are not really foreign cells. They're our own body cells, but they have been damaged and they are growing out of control and they have abnormal function. So for example, a cancer cell that originates in the breast is an abnormal breast cell that is starting to grow rapidly and has the original DNA of a breast cell, but it's been damaged in some way, and as a result becomes cancerous, and it can spread from that tissue and invade other tissues depending on the extent of spread. And we'll talk about that a little bit later when we get into cancer. So cancer cells are our own body cells. They're not foreign, but they have been changed in some way that they become cancerous. So we'll talk more about that. So when you look at our immune system, there are two branches of the immune system. There's the innate and the adaptive. The innate immune system are things that are always in place that prevent us from infection or getting sick. So innate means they're always there. They've always been there, ready to attack any foreign substances that might enter the body. The adaptive immune system is one that develops and changes over time as we're exposed to a foreign substance. So when you get the stomach flu, for example, the adaptive defenses kick in as we develop antibodies to that flu virus while we're actively sick with the flu. So what we do to protect people from getting sick in the first place is we give them a vaccine, we immunize. That causes them to build antibodies against the flu virus before they actually get sick. So adaptive just means that it's something that develops when we're exposed to a pathogen, whether it be in the weakened, killed form, such as in a vaccine or an immunization, or if it's through actively contracting the virus in the community. So the innate is the first one we're going to talk about, and this is always there, always ready. It doesn't need previous experience with that foreign substance or pathogen. So a pathogen is just anything that is foreign to the body and causes damage or disease. So with the nonspecific innate immune defenses, we say they're nonspecific because they're always there. They're not developed in response to a specific foreign thing. They're just there for any foreign substance that should enter the body. So we have both physical barriers, which is basically barriers to prevent entry into the body, and we have chemical barriers, which are chemicals in the tissues and in the surface of the skin and also in the blood that will damage and destroy pathogens if they should come in the body. We also have the inflammatory response and then protective proteins as well. And we'll get into each one of these. But just remember that innate defenses are always there. They're not specific, and they don't recognize a specific pathogen as being like bacteria or a toxin. All they know is that it's foreign, and they don't remember if they've seen it once before. These defenses act the same way no matter what the pathogen is. So it's not like when we have an antibody response where the body remembers the virus and mounts a large response the second time we're sick. Innate defenses are just nonspecific, no memory. They're just ready and waiting at any time if a foreign substance should enter the body. So the first line of defense against pathogens entering the body are these physical barriers. And physical barriers are the skin and the mucous membrane. If we look at our skin, it has this waxy protective coating called keratin. It's very tough. It protects things from entering into the skin. And as it sloughs away, it carries microbes with it away from the body. Our skin is constantly sloughing off. We lose our entire surface of our skin about every 30 days. It turns over and is replaced with new skin from below. So that is our first barrier to entry, is just keeping our skin intact. If you cut your skin, then we've broken that first line of defense, and pathogens can enter into our body. Mucous membranes that line our digestive tract, they line our airways, they line our mouth, they line the anal and vaginal openings. They have special cells with cilia, short little hair-like structures that sweep mucus trapped with pathogens toward an area where they can be removed. For example, in the airways, the cilia beats the mucus with trapped air particles and debris, trapped particles, I should say, in the air that are debris. The mucus sweeps those trapped pathogens up toward the throat to the digestive tract so it can be swallowed down. In the back of the nose, the cilia in the mucous membranes beats toward the back of the throat to be swallowed down. So these mucous membranes with the cilia are constantly moving that mucus with trapped debris toward the digestive tract where they can be swallowed. We also have mechanisms like coughing and sneezing that are stimulated by mucous membranes that are filled with debris and need to be swept away in a more forceful way from those areas. So that's physical. Those are physical barriers, actual structures that prevent entry. Chemical barriers are things that we find in our tissues that are specific chemicals to break down and destroy pathogens. For example, our sweat has an acidic pH value, so that will destroy bacteria on the skin. Saliva has enzymes for killing bacteria. Our tears have enzymes called, all three of these secretions, as a matter of fact, have the enzyme lysozyme, which breaks down bacteria and prevents infection. So if a person has a very dry mouth or very dry eyes, they're more prone to infection because of less activity of this enzyme lysozyme. So these are important chemicals that we have to protect us from infection as things enter in through the skin, through the mouth, and through the eyes and nose. Other chemical barriers: when we eat food, some of the bacteria in the food we eat, which is definitely not sterile, is killed by the acidic pH of our stomach. So that is a benefit of a high acid content in the stomach, is just killing that bacteria. We also have bacteria in our digestive tract, in our mouth, digestive tract, in the anal and pubic regions that protect us from infection. So we have natural bacteria, natural flora, we have fungal organisms and bacterial organisms in just the right balance to keep those areas in check and free of infection. So if you've ever known somebody who has had a yeast infection, if it's in the mouth, we call that thrush. If it's in the foot, we call it athlete's foot. And in the vaginal area, we call that a yeast infection. So those are examples of times when the normal flora is out of balance, whether it be through antibiotics killing the normal bacteria in those areas, causing the fungal organisms to overgrow, or if it's due to excess fungal organisms. So there's a variety of causes of some of those infections, but we need that normal balance of bacteria and fungal organisms in the body to keep things in check and prevent infection. So when we look at the innate immune defenses, this is a nice little diagram that summarizes things. We have these barriers to entry, so preventing pathogens from coming in. We have the skin and mucous membranes. Then we have these protective proteins that are found in the blood, things like complement, interferons. Those are things that are present in the blood that are always available to prevent infection and enhance immunity. We also have special cells, white blood cells in the bloodstream that can leave the bloodstream and enter into infected tissues and actively destroy pathogens. So we have cells like natural killer cells here, dendritic cells, macrophages, that actively envelop and wrap their cell membrane around these pathogens here, this bacteria, and prevent infection. And because of that process, the leaking of capillaries and allowing these white blood cells to enter the area and excess fluid and cytokines, it causes inflammation. So the inflammatory response has a couple of characteristics that are pretty classic, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with the inflammatory response. The 4 hallmark symptoms are redness due to the dilation of due to the dilation of capillaries and the leaking of red blood cells from the area that causes redness and heat, and swelling as excess fluid enters that damaged tissue. And some of the chemicals released by damaged tissues also release chemicals that cause pain. So those are the 4 characteristics of inflammation: is redness, heat, swelling, and pain. And if we see that for an extended period of time, or if we see that increasing over time, that's a sign of an increasing infection, and then a person definitely needs to be seen. So if you ever cut yourself and you see redness, heat, swelling, and pain increasing rather than getting better over over the short period of time, then it should definitely be evaluated, because there's a lot of simple cuts that have turned into pretty serious infections nowadays. So we need to really keep an eye on this inflammatory response and make sure that it's getting better over time and not getting worse. So there's chemicals such as histamine that causes those capillaries, like I said, to dilate. They become more permeable, so proteins can leak out from those capillaries into the damaged area. Again, the dilation of the capillaries causes the redness, and the increased blood flow to the area causes the heat, and then the leaking of fluid causes the swelling. And some of those chemicals induce a painful stimulus to receptors in that damaged area. So this is the second line of defense. So once the pathogens have broken through the first line of defense, which is the skin and mucous membranes, the second line of defense has to kick in with this inflammatory response. So we kind of talked about how these 4 hallmark symptoms are caused, but the benefit of the increased temperature is that because of the excess blood flow to the area, that also inhibits the growth of those pathogens. So by making it warmer in area where the breach of the barriers occurred, it also will inhibit growth of pathogens. And we see increased blood flow because of those dilated blood vessels, and that brings white blood cells present in the blood to that area. So here's a nice, overall summary of the inflammatory response. So we have injured tissue cells releasing this histamine, which causes capillaries to dilate, so that means they get larger in size, blood flow increases, and then those macrophages that leaked out of the capillary and entered into the tissues, they start to destroy and take in these bacteria and break them down with enzymes. And then these macrophages also release cytokines, which will stimulate more inflammation, again, kind of enhancing this whole process. And then we can see other white blood cells like neutrophils and monocytes squeeze out of the capillaries. There's holes in the capillary, and they squeeze out of there and start to destroy bacteria. And then eventually blood clots are going to form at the broken blood vessel, and that's going to prevent further blood loss, and we'll start to see a scab forming over time as white blood cells and other tissue, dried, dead tissue, clogs that area. So it's important that we have the inflammatory response, but again, if it's left to go unchecked, it can cause damage over time. So we want to treat any chronic inflammation, especially when we see fluid in an area. It's going to press on nerve endings and cause extra pain. So to prevent that excess fluid buildup, that's why we wrap damaged ankles or sprained ankles, sprained fingers. We like to wrap those to prevent excess fluid buildup. We know that white blood cells move out of the bloodstream. We already talked about that. One of the first white blood cells that leaves the bloodstream are neutrophils, because they're good at taking in bacteria and breaking them down. But if we see lots of neutrophils in an area and lots of bacteria, we see a buildup of a substance, which is pus, and that's the yellowish white substance coming out of an infected tissue. We don't want to see that. That's a sign of an advanced infection. So it's important, again, that infections be treated seriously and be treated with just a topical antibiotic at first. And sometimes if we see infection that persists in spite of using good soap and water after the cut occurs and topical antibiotics, sometimes it requires an oral antibiotic. Or if it goes on even longer unchecked, IV antibiotics. Sometimes we see that. So it's important that we treat small cuts and injuries seriously and get them nice and clean and put some antibiotic ointment on them and keep them covered if they're going to be exposed to dirty environmental conditions. So we already talked about the cytokines. Those are chemicals that are released by neutrophils that attract more white blood cells, and they pretty much enhance the inflammatory response. So that's our first and second lines of defense. The first line of defense, we already said, were things like the barriers of the skin and the mucous membranes, the cilia, and then those proteins that were present. And then the second line of defense was the inflammatory response. And sometimes that's not enough to take care of the infection. So we also have adaptive defenses. And when these innate defenses have failed to prevent an infection, we need these adaptive defenses. So these are things that develop upon exposure to foreign particles. And anything that the body considers foreign is called an antigen. So the adaptive defenses respond to antigens. They are specific to those antigens, and they can identify bacteria, viruses, molds, parasitic worms, etc. And we develop different antibodies, or different cells respond more specifically to one type of antigen than another, and we'll talk about some of those. But anything that's foreign is called an antigen, and an antibody can be formed against that antigen. So when we look at the plasma membrane proteins of cancer cells, they have an abnormal plasma membrane because of being damaged by radiation or a virus. There's a number of different causes of our regular body cells becoming cancerous, but they will be recognized by the immune system as cancerous. So the immune system can distinguish between cancer-infected cells versus normal self cells. So anything that has a pathogen associated with it is called non-self. Anything that is normal and healthy and that we were born with and that the body wants to maintain, those are called self cells. So when we look at the adaptive defenses, there's two major cells that come into play, and those are the B cells and T cells. They are in the category of lymphocytes. When we look at the white blood cells in the blood, these are called lymphocytes. And they have specific antigen receptors that they respond to. So each lymphocyte has a specific receptor, and it can bind to an antigen and take it out of circulation and deactivate that antigen, preventing infection. So we'll look at a little bit how that works. So we have, when you talk about adaptive immunity, we have cells that can bind specific antigens, but those antigens are inside of those cells, and then we have antigens outside of cells that are antibody mediated. So when we form antibodies, or we have cells that can identify antigens on the surface, both of those are examples of adaptive immunity. So in the next video, we'll talk in detail about what an antibody is and how this adaptive immunity functions.